Good afternoon, everybody. So, to build a bridge to the presentation that we just heard, by the way, a very interesting presentation. Um, it's not only traditional banks that are facing a lot of change in the environment, it's also Austrian households. And hence, I have the opportunity today to present you a recent Raiffeisen research publication. So my name is Fabian Blasch. I've been with Raiffeisen Research for about 2.5 years now. And today, I will give you a quick intro into buying versus renting and give a strategic overview what the current market environment will show us whether this is a reasonable choice or not. And to start out with, actually, I'd like to give a brief overview of the current state that the Austrian residential real estate market is in, where we came from, and where we are potentially going. And as you can see quite impressively here in the chart on the left-hand side, the Austrian residential real estate market has shown a quite substantial increase in prices. So since the beginning of the 2000s, right until the pandemic, prices have increased by, they have doubled essentially by 100%. And then when the pandemic came around, many people were asking themselves, okay, what does this now mean for residential real estate markets? And turns out it actually made prices increase even faster. So then with Q3 2022, we had, as we like to call it sometimes, a double headwind. So we saw the introduction of a regulatory piece, the so-called KIM-Verordnung, which calls for 20% equity capital as a requirement to get a loan to finance a house or a flat. And in addition to that, you also can only spend up to 40% of household monthly income in order to service your debt. And this is not the only headwind. As already mentioned, it was a double headwind. So in addition to that, we also saw the most substantial and quickest increase of key rates in ECB history. And of course, for financing a home, this is a substantial headwind. And this also showed itself in less demand and therefore dropping prices. But since the peak that we've reached in Q3 2022, prices have only decreased by roughly 5%. And this is actually a very small decrease, considering for the headwind that we've seen, right? So what's behind this small decrease of 5%? Well, in actuality, if you take up the covers and take a look, a more in detailed look, you will see that if you take real terms, you see that the correction of 5% in nominal terms is actually minus 16%. And now you might ask yourself the question, okay, why would I care how real estate prices changed in real terms? I'm not concerned about how many schnitzels I have to come up with to buy a house or a flat. But the important aspect here is what happens to wages if we see inflation. Wages increase, right? And especially in Austria, wages are very closely linked to inflation. So what this means is that if we see a real price correction, this makes housing more affordable in comparison to before. So what this means is that affordability has increased since Q3 2022 and more substantially than the minus 5% correction in nominal terms would actually suggest. So we already see that the demand pressure is being released to a certain extent. The demand is coming back on the real estate market. But now let's also take a second look at supply. So on the right-hand side chart, you see building completions and building permits. And you can very clearly see there's been a substantial decrease in supply, meaning that from the peak in 2022, actually the buildings that are completed have decreased for almost 40% in comparison to our forecast in 2026. So much to set the stage on where the real estate market currently stands. Now, why does this matter for whether you should rent or buy a flat? Well, of course, you wouldn't want to buy a flat if you expect real estate prices to decrease substantially in the coming quarters. But as we've seen demand coming back and we've seen supply dropping even further, in our opinion, this is the most that we've seen in terms of a price correction, and in the coming quarters, we're expecting prices to slowly increase again. Of course, this doesn't mean that we expect prices to increase as previously in the pandemic and prior to the pandemic in sometimes yearly changes in the range of 10%. However, in this interest rate environment, we believe there will be rather muted price increases, but nevertheless no further price decreases. And now, to get into what the talk is actually supposed to be about, it's whether you should now rent or buy. So how does one make a quantitative decision on whether you should rent a flat or buy a flat? Well, first of all, you have to think about what the wealth development of a buyer and the renter would look like and what it's influenced by. So for the buyer, you have one big payment at the start, so you have to come up with the equity capital, as Kim Fordner calls for, 20%. And then in addition to that, you have a monthly loan installment that you also have to pay. In comparison to that, the person who rents a flat only has to pay for the rent. And that's it, right? So what does this mean? To make this comparable, we need to assume that both the renter and the owner actually have the 20% equity capital. And then we can go ahead and say, okay, the person who rents doesn't put it towards financing a home, but they put it into a stock market fund. For example, as it's depicted here, this is a comparison of the MSCI World, the yearly return, and the Austrian real estate index provided by the ÖNB. And I brought this picture with me today because it's very telling about the next modeling choices that we have to make. As you can see, across the last 30 years, there is a vast difference in price change, or in the MSCI World case, average yearly return. But then also, there's a vast difference in volatility. And this is not something that's a big secret, right? Equity markets are a lot more volatile than, for example, real estate markets, but this is something that we have to take into account when we compare renting versus buying. And this is the reason why we used a Monte Carlo simulation to be able to also implement those differences in volatility across asset classes. So what do? We assume that, as already previously mentioned, the buyer puts his 20% equity capital into the real estate market, pays his monthly loan installments. The renter uses those 20% equity capital, puts them into the stock market, and for the next 30 years, that's what we assume how long the loan will take to pay off, each month the difference between what's paid towards renting and what's paid towards the loan installment is either invested in terms of the renter, so into the equity market, if the rent is higher than what's needed to be paid for the loan installment, and if it's the other way around, it's taken out of the equity investment to make things fair. Okay, so now let's get into the results. What does this mean? And I've brought you today an example, the third district in Vienna. And the first thing that I'd like to point out is here in the chart on the right-hand side, because there's one very crucial characteristic of this comparison that one has to understand. And this is, you can see there's a difference at the starting line. And why is there a difference at the starting line for buying and renting? Quite obvious for some, not so obvious for others. Simply there's auxiliary costs associated with buying a home. That means you have to pay for realtor, you have to pay for lawyer, you have to pay taxes and some other stuff, not to get into the nitty-gritty details here, but this is a setback for the home purchase at time t equals 0. But, and this is the second most important thing to realize, looking at this graph here, once you think about the difference between a loan installment and the rent payment, there's one significant difference. And this is the loan installment is constant over time. If you have, sorry, and the rent payment is usually indexed with inflation. So rent payments are increasing over time and loan installments are constant over time. And this leads to this increasing median wealth of the buyer, which is depicted here in yellow, and this also increasing median wealth of the renter. However, there's a difference in the speed in which they pick up. And what's also very important to mention at this point is that the assumptions that have been put in here are average values for the third Viennese district. And of course, depending on what values you put into the simulation, you will get drastically different results. And to maybe put also into perspective what this means for the other districts, so we not only did this for the third district in Vienna, we actually did this for all 116 political districts in Austria. And the results vary quite drastically. So what you can see here is the break-even point between renting and buying for each district. And what is the break-even point? It is the break-even point is the point at which buying is worth it, so to speak. And you can see here that the variability across districts is quite substantial. So it ranges from 4 years until buying is actually better than renting in north of Lower Austria. And then you have, especially in the west of Austria, you have significantly higher numbers, and also in some Viennese districts, of course. And why is this the case? Because purchasing prices are a lot higher here. And this is the most important factor when making those comparisons across districts, because the variability in purchasing costs is quite significantly higher than the variability in rents. So across districts, the most important determining factor is how much you actually pay for your flat. And now, last but very certainly not least, another interesting point is, we've talked about wages before, and we've established that wages are closely knit to inflation and are generally associated to have an upwards trend over the lifetime of a household. So it would also be interesting to see, okay, if the person now decides to buy a home and at some point the wages increase to a point that it would also be an option to invest into the equity markets, how do those two asset classes, how do they compare, or not how do they combine in a portfolio? Are they well suited to be combined in a portfolio? And I think this chart is very telling in this case, because we can see here the correlation between the changes in Austrian real estate market price changes, as well as the return of the MSCI World, are almost show no correlation. So in terms of modern portfolio theory, you could say that they are well suited to be combined in a portfolio. Yes, and this also already puts me at the end of my short speech. Of course, I've previously mentioned it in passing, that there are a lot of assumptions that go into this, and whether renting or buying makes more sense is only to a certain extent reasonable to be evaluated with average values for anything, right? Because those average values, they're not realized for many people. What does this mean? Especially in Austria, on the rent market, there are vastly different forms of renting a flat, right? And depending on where you rent your flat, you're also subject to different legislation, so on and so forth. Meaning, on the one hand, we have this research publication which summarizes all the different assumptions that we took, and I encourage you to read it if you're interested. On the other hand, I'm now also planning to code up a dashboard which will allow you to put in all of your assumptions and all of your, let's say, for example, how much rent you're paying, and also how much the flat that you may be interested in would cost to purchase, and this would then allow you to compare the different wealth paths for renting and buying, not only for the average of the Austrian districts, but also for your inputs. And this one, if you want to be kept up to date, feel free to follow me on LinkedIn. Thank you very much. If there are any questions and we have some time, then I'm happy to take those.